Hello oceanography students. For this video we are going to be discussing two important environments in the ocean, coral reefs and kelp forests. So prior to watching this lecture, you should watch the videos that are about coral reefs and kelp forests just to get an idea of what they are and what they look like. Okay. So I showed you this table previously when we were talking about primary productivity in the oceans, and I wanted to highlight the fact that algae beds, which coral reefs are algae beds, and kelp forests are algae beds, and coral reefs are the highest productivity environments in the ocean, and they can also be higher productivity environments than swamps, marshes, or rainforests even. Okay, so for this video, we're first going to talk about the distribution of coral and kelp in the world. Then we'll talk about coral reefs. We'll talk about how they're formed and what coral is, about the environmental factors that influence where you can find coral and whether coral is healthy. And then we'll talk about some ecology, which means the interactions that exist in coral reefs. And then we'll talk about kelp forests, and we'll talk about how seaweeds are different from terrestrial plants. We'll talk about different types of seaweeds and their pigments that make them the color that they are. We'll talk about the structure of kelp and some environmental factors that influence where they're found, as well as some kelp forest ecology as well. Alright, so this map is showing us different places around the world where we can find coral reefs and kelp forests. Coral reefs are in red and the kelp forests are in green. So what you should notice pretty quickly are that usually you're not finding kelp forests in places where you're finding coral reefs. Generally the coral reefs are in the tropics. So here's the Tropic of Cancer. Remember, that's about 23.5 degrees north, and here's the Tropic of Capricorn. That's 23.5 degrees south. Those are the highest limits that the sun hits directly, right? So the sun will be hitting here in June, and then the sun will be hitting down here in December. Okay? So, and then in the middle, the sun is hitting at the equator, and kind of just because of the tilt of the earth, it's hitting all across this area from June through December. Okay, so coral is found in warmer waters, and its kelp is found in cooler waters. And also something that's in common for both of them is that they are not out in the middle of the ocean where there's no land. They are along shorelines, they are along land, and that's because they both require the water to be fairly shallow. Now over here, what we're seeing coral reefs around islands here as well, and here and out here as well. Okay, so there is land there. They are not just there by themselves. So let's start out by talking about what coral is. So coral is in the phylum Cnidaria. It is a small benthic animal. Okay, so coral is an animal. It is not a plant. It's not algae, and it's in the phylum Cnidaria, which means that it has stinging cells. Okay, or cells that are at the ends of their tentacles. If you look closely at this image here, this is a blown up image of what a coral polyp looks like. And specifically a coral polyp that would be contributing to making coral reefs. So essentially it looks very similar to a sea anemone. It has a soft body, it has a mouth in the middle, it has tentacles that are surrounding the mouth, and this is just a cutout, right? So it would be round, and so it's radially symmetrical, and along its tentacles it has stinging cells which it uses to eat, to grab onto plankton. So it's a soft-bodied organism, so it doesn't have any hard parts, except that it does make this little skeleton, or it's kind of like a little cup that it sits in, it makes it out of calcium carbonate. So it's that hard structure that you are probably familiar with in reefs. Okay, they're colonial organisms, which means that they live with other individuals. So you'll have other individuals growing right beside these guys, and basically their little calcium carbonate cup that they sit in is attached to the calcium carbonate cup of the one who's next to it, and so on and so forth. And you can see that if you ever had like just the skeleton of the coral, which is what you would have if you had it outside of the water and had broken it off, whatever. That's not a living organism, it's just the shell that's left over. So you would see that it was, if you look very closely, there are multiple little tiny holes in it. Each little hole would have held an actual little animal, and those hard structure around it was this hard structure here. Now, another thing about the coral is that living within its tissue, so if we look right here along the outer edge of what's called epidermal tissue, if we look right there and zoom in, you see these little squares right here. These little squares represent zooxanthellae, which are a type of phytoplankton actually. So coral has living within its tissue a dinoflagellate called zooxanthellae. And you can see that in this zoomed in image of coral polyps. You can see these little dots right along the outer edge of their bodies. Those little dots are actually the zooxanthellae. So zooxanthellae are photosynthetic organisms that are unicellular, made up of just one cell, just like all dinoflagellates are. And it's actually the zooxanthellae that give the coral their color. So if a zooxanthellae leaves the coral, then the coral loses its color, and we call it bleached because it just turns white. That doesn't necessarily mean that the coral's dead. It just means that the zooxanthellae have left and it's not as healthy. And the reason why it's not as healthy is because the zooxanthellae and the coral exist in a type of symbiotic relationship called mutualism. A symbiotic relationship is a relationship in which two individuals of different species live very closely together, and in which at least one of them is benefiting from their relationship. So in mutualism, actually both of the organisms benefit. So both the coral and the zooxanthellae are benefiting from this relationship of the zooxanthellae living in the tissue of the coral. And so what the coral provide is protection for the zooxanthellae. It's also providing for nutrients for the zooxanthellae to photosynthesize and be healthy. The zooxanthellae in return are providing oxygen for the coral because it is an animal, it does respire, and it's also providing for food for the coral. So the zooxanthellae, by way of photosynthesis, actually make sugars that the coral can then eat. And coral actually have a hard time getting a lot of nutrients and a lot of food without having these zooxanthellae in their tissue. So if the zooxanthellae leave because the conditions aren't very good, then the coral won't be as healthy. And again, that's called coral bleaching. So some other symbiotic relationships include commensalism and parasitism. Okay, so again, a symbiosis or a symbiotic relationship is a close relationship between two species in which at least one benefits. So mutualism, again, is a win-win relationship in which both of the individuals benefit from the relationship. So we saw, for example, the coral and the zooxanthellae exist in a mutualistic relationship in which they both benefit from that relationship. Another example that's seen in kelp or coral reefs, is this moray eel up here and the cleaner shrimp. So, the moray eel has lots of parasites that like to grow on it, and so this cleaner shrimp will come along and eat the parasites off. So in this way, the eel is getting its parasites removed, so it's getting healthier, and the shrimp is getting food. Another type of symbiotic relationship, commensalism, is a relationship in which one wins and the other one isn't bothered. So, for example, something that exists in coral reefs is our carrier crabs and fire urchins. So carrier crabs are crabs that have a specialized appendage towards the back of their body that acts as a hook so that the crab can essentially take things and put it on its back. So that's why it's called the carrier crab, because it carries things around. Now, sometimes the carrier crabs will find a fire urchin, which is essentially toxic and nothing wants to mess with it, and it will put that fire urchin on its back. And in this way, the fire urchin is providing the crab with protection, and the fire urchin is not being harmed by the relationship. It's not really benefiting by it either. And then a third type of symbiosis is parasitism, in which one benefits and one loses. So you can think of the parasites on the eel that are essentially taking nutrients away from that eel and making the eel less healthy, whereas the parasites are winning because they're getting nutrients and surviving. Okay, now there are two general categories of coral. We have hard or stony coral and soft coral. So hard or stony coral is what makes the coral reef. These are the corals that have the zooxanthellae living in their tissues, and they make their little cup or their exoskeleton out of calcium carbonate, and so they have a hard structure, such as the coral seen in these pictures here. But the other type of coral, soft coral, also uses calcium carbonate to make its outer structure, but it also mixes it with protein, which makes it a little less rigid and more flexible. For example, sea fans, which are shown here, are an example of a soft coral. Now, the hard or stony corals are the ones that have to be in the light because of their zooxanthellae, whereas the sea fans can live much deeper down and be healthy. Okay, so again, the non-reef forming corals, the soft corals, are found pretty much everywhere. They can be at any depth. It's the reef forming corals that are restricted to certain conditions. One is that they need to be in the sunlight because of their zooxanthellae. Therefore, they have to be in shallow water. That's why when we're looking at that map, we were only seeing them around coastal environments, because they need to be in shallow water where the sunlight is penetrating through to them. They like to be in warm water, where the average monthly water temperature is between 18 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. Their optimal temperature range is 23 to 25 degrees Celsius. Those are the temperatures in which they will grow the quickest and be the healthiest. They need to be in stable, salty environments. So not too salty, obviously, but also not near river mouths either, because the mouths of the rivers coming into the ocean is bringing fresh water into that area. So they usually are not found around rivers. Additionally, around rivers, there's a lot of sediment that gets put into the water, and that would cause the water to be murky and for there not to be a lot of sunlight. So the coral also needs clear, clean water that has low pollution and low sedimentation, and generally kind of a low amount of very thick plankton that's also blocking the light. They need to have nutrients, so they need to be in an environment with good circulation, and they also need a hard substrate to grow on. So coral reefs form around land and around islands. So this image here, which is figure 12.26 in your textbook, is showing you the progression of coral from being a fringing reef existing around an island all the way to being a essentially a table mount due to tectonic activity changes. Okay, so remember that islands are forming basically because there is magma coming up from the earth and building new material on land, building new lithosphere. And that can happen by way of convergence between two oceanic plates, or it can happen due to hotspots. Okay, so right here we have a new island that has formed, and what will happen is the zooplankton that are coral will eventually settle down on the hard substrate in the shallow waters and start to grow and develop into what's called a fringing reef. It fringes the edges of the island. Now, as time goes on, we see that heat supply that builds the lithosphere is gradually going away. So because it's not building up the island as much, there's more erosion that can happen with the island. So the island sinks back down, but the reef is a nice hard structure and therefore it stays there. And so now we have what's called a barrier reef around the island. As the island sinks farther down, it's no longer visible, and instead all that you have is the reef that's around it. Now that reef is what we call an atoll. So we have atolls that people actually live on, and for example, Midway Atoll is an example of that. And then as it continues to sink down, eventually the coral reef gets eroded as well, and we end up with just a table mount under the water. Okay, how long does it take for coral to grow? So massive corals that are basically flat, not with a bunch of branches, they grow at a rate of about 0.3 to 2 centimeters per year. So that's pretty slow. But the branching corals grow much more quickly at about 10 centimeters per year. And the reason for the branching corals to need to grow faster is that they are often broken away by strong storm activity and wave activity. So if they're not growing quickly, that wave activity and that storm activity can break them away, and then they would just basically be shrinking rather than growing. So therefore it can take up to 10,000 years for a coral reef to form. That's a really long time. And depending on their size, barrier reefs and atolls can take 100,000 to 30 million years to fully form. For example, in its current state, the Great Barrier Reef started forming about 120,000 years ago. So these are very delicate structures in our environment. Why is coral important? Why do we care about coral? Remember that in the tropics, productivity is generally very low. So the coral kind of acts as an oasis in a desert because it's one of the most productive environments in the world. It's home to about 25% of all marine species and a third of the world's marine fish. It fringes about a sixth of the world's coastlines, which means that all those fish are accessible to humans for food. They provide for breeding grounds, shelter, and food for lots of different organisms, fish and invertebrates as well. And they have been shown to have more biodiversity than tropical rainforests. So remember, biodiversity means how many different types of organisms are in an environment and how different is one individual from the other within a specific species. Okay, and we see lots of examples of symbiosis in the coral reefs, and that shows that the reef organisms are interdependent on one another, and therefore if we harm one, then we're going to harm the other ones, and especially if we harm the coral itself, that coral is basically the habitat for these organisms, so they're going to be very greatly impacted by that. Okay. So again, coral is found in the tropics in shallow waters and along coastlines. Kelp forests are found in more temperate or cooler waters. So there are generally three categories of algae, and kelp is an example of a brown algae or phaeophyta. So we have the green algae, which are in the division Chlorophyta, and basically their word means plant-like, green plant-like organism. So they appear obviously very green. They have chlorophyll A and B as their dominant pigments, and that's why they appear that color. For green algae, we don't see as many marine species as we do freshwater species, but there are some, such as the picture here, which is ulva, or sea lettuce. Then we have the division Phaeophyta, which are the brown algae, and anything that is photosynthetic will contain chlorophyll, but some have other pigments that are called accessory pigments that will essentially mask the color of the chlorophyll. So Phaeophyta, they have a pigment that's called xanthophyll, and that xanthophyll actually, or fucoxanthin is another one, that actually appears golden brown, and it masks that bright green color. So instead, these seaweeds appear golden brown, and kelp is included in the Phaeophyta or brown algae. So kelp forests are structured by a brown alga. Then finally we have division Rhodophyta, which are the red algae. They contain chlorophyll also, right, because they're photosynthetic, but they also have pigments that are called phycobilins, and those pigments make them appear red, and sometimes they can even appear almost like a dark purple color as well. These ones are even more diverse in their shape and sizes, from one red algae to the next than the brown algae or the green algae are. With the Rhodophyta, there are even some that make a kind of a skeleton structure out of calcium carbonate, which makes them harder and makes them stronger.
Hi guys, I am at the beach in Shelter Cove, California, and I thought that I would make you guys a little video that pertains to some of the stuff that we've been learning about. So let's look at what we see. Alright, so you can see some of the waves crashing here with the coast of California in an area that is basically an erosional coast. You can see the cliffs, you can see that it's very rocky, even the berm, as you can see, is rocky. It's not fine sands, unlike what you would find in a depositional coast. And basically what I'm looking at are tide pools. So you can see kind of the ocean back in the distance there, but closer up you can see depressions where the water has filled in when the tide has gone out. So essentially the tide comes in, the water level is higher. You can see that in some places the rocks have eroded up the shoreline, basically because the water level is higher during high tide, and then it goes back out. And when it goes back out, because there's these depressions in the rocks, what happens is you have water that pulls up, and you can have intertidal organisms living in them. So one thing that I'm going to show you guys is a bunch of different algae that I'm finding. So if we look at this rock, it looks kind of fuzzy.
And there's red algae.
Yes, thank you, my assistant Amelia. Thank you. Okay, so this right here, it looks kind of brownish, but it's actually red algae here. And so let's see if I can show you it a bit closer up. Okay, so there's some red algae. And let's see if I can find some brown algae or
Let me look for
some green algae also.
hermit crab. Let me look for hermit crabs.
Yes, we found lots of hermit crabs here also. They're a pretty common intertidal organism as well. So all of these organisms that are living in tide pools are intertidal organisms. This is considered the intertidal zone. Okay, so right here, I found a little piece. This right here. That looks really green, right? It's actually a type of brown algae. It's kind of fucus or rockweed.
I think this is
Baby's not in it right now. Let's see.
Mom, I found this.
I know I saw some green algae around
I
here.
found this.
Alright, so it doesn't look like I found any green algae. This is actually red algae, and then the one that looks greener is actually brown algae. It's the rockweed that I was talking about, so I'm going to show it to you as like a larger kind of alga example. And then if we look close to the rocks, look really close, there are a bunch of little snails on here. And the hermit crabs, when those snails die, the hermit crabs will use their shells as their home. And also the little tiny things, you don't like that, huh, baby? The little tiny things, you've got some barnacles on this rock as well. So there's tons of living things on this rock that does not look like it's living at all. I finally found some green algae.
I need to take some green algae home.
So we can look closely at it, and you can see that that is the bright, bright green color. That's the green algae. No, Alright, so I'm wondering if anybody knows what I have here. They may look like some sort of skeleton of something, right? So you're kind of right if you said that, but it's not what you think. This is actually the skeleton of something called coralline algae. It's a type of red algae that actually makes a hardened structure out of calcium carbonate, which is the same thing that clams and mussels make their shells out of. So I also have some that is still alive, so I can show you the difference of what it looks like. So here is another example of red algae, and red algae, like you learn about in the video about algae and kelp and coral. The red algae actually comes in more kind of ranges of shapes and sizes, and so this is like a perfect example of that.
Okay, so seaweeds are not plants, and so a couple of differences include that terrestrial plants have roots, whereas seaweeds do not have roots. Instead, they have what's called a holdfast. For terrestrial plants, roots can take in nutrients. That's one of the purposes of roots. And seaweeds, they don't have those roots, and their holdfast, that is for anchoring, doesn't allow for nutrient absorption. It's basically just an anchor. Terrestrial plants have veins going through their leaves, whereas seaweeds have a leaf-like structure that's called a blade, and that doesn't have veins going through it. For terrestrial plants, if you look at a leaf, it has a distinct upper and lower surface, where the upper surface tends to be shinier because it has a waxy coating on it. Seaweeds don't have that. Basically, if you look at the top surface of the blade and the bottom surface of the blade, they're generally the same. Terrestrial plants, some produce seeds to reproduce. Seaweeds do not produce seeds. Terrestrial plants have a vascular system, which essentially is like your vascular system in your body, veins, right? Terrestrial plants actually have that same system to transport nutrients through their bodies, whereas seaweeds don't have that. And one of the big reasons why seaweeds don't have that is because their nutrients are surrounding them. So they don't actually need to get nutrients from specific places and then transport them to other places in the body. The nutrients are all around them. Okay, so we're going to look at the structure of a kelp using the giant kelp or macrocystis as an example. So this structure that the arrows are pointing at is called the blade. This is a structure that is similar to a leaf in appearance, but it's different from a leaf in the reasons that I just stated. The blade's main function is that it's the main site of photosynthesis. Then these little ball-like structures that you can see circled here, and they're also at the base of every single blade of the giant kelp, is called the pneumatocyst. A pneumatocyst is a little bulb that is filled with gas that makes the alga buoyant and makes it float towards the surface. The reason why is because it needs to be closest to the sun for photosynthesis. So it's essentially, otherwise it would basically just flop over, and these little bulbs, these little pneumatocysts, help for the blades to get closest to the surface to photosynthesize. Then this structure, which is similar to the stalk of a plant, is called the stipe, and its purpose is to essentially hold the blades to the anchoring system that's called the holdfast. The holdfast is root-like in its appearance for many different types of kelp, not all of them though, because it's composed of lots of little fibers that are called heptera, and those fibers sort of look like the roots of a tree. But if you touch them, they don't feel like those roots. They're very different. They're kind of rubbery and flexible. And their purpose, again, is just to anchor the alga to the rock or anchor the kelp to the rock. Some holdfasts just look like a disc. Stronger ones do look fibrous, similar to the look of a plant's root. But again, these are not roots. They are just an anchoring system. Okay, so kelp also has some environmental requirements for where it can live. Again, it needs a rocky substrate, so essentially it needs something to attach to. And if you look closely in this image, we can see the holdfast of these different kelp. And additionally, they need to be in shallow water. So they need to live in water that is no more than about 30 meters deep. And the reason why is because they need the sunlight, again, for photosynthesis. Okay, because remember that the kelp or the seaweed is going to start out at the sea floor and then grow up. So it needs to be able to be in an environment where the sea floor is actually getting enough light for them to be able to grow. They also need to be found in nutrient-rich water and higher nutrient-rich water than the corals do, because they need to be in cooler water, water that is between 5 and 20 degrees Celsius. So if you get into the tropics, then that's getting a little too warm for them. They also need clear water, again, for light to be penetrating through. Okay. Now, kelp forests usually are made up of lots of different species, but there is one species that is the major forest creator. Okay, so I have some images put on this map along with the names of the major species of kelp that makes the kelp forest in different places. So on our coast, we have giant kelp, which is this picture here, Macrocystis, and we also have the bull kelp, which is Nereocystis. About at, we'll say, probably about Monterey Bay south, the kelp forests are mostly made up of the giant kelp, and from about Monterey Bay north, the kelp forests are made up of the bull kelp. So we can look a little bit at the difference in their structure here. So the giant kelp, we have blades running the whole length of the stipe, and at the base of every blade there is a nematocyst, or a little gas-filled float. Whereas with the bull kelp has this long stipe, and then at the end of the stipe there is a big nematocyst, and then there are multiple blades that are coming off of that one nematocyst. Okay, so it's a slightly different structure. And again, if you went off of our coast looking for kelp forests, most likely those kelp forests would be made out of bull kelp. And if you went south to Southern California and looked at the kelp forest there, then the kelp forest would mostly be made out of giant kelp. Okay, and if you go in different places, sometimes their kelp forests are made out of another type of kelp called laminaria, or this other type of kelp called Lawsonia or Clonia. So there are a couple of different varieties, but you can see that the Macrocystis, or the giant kelp, is actually pretty common in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so kelp provide for a three-dimensional structure in the environment. So the kelp itself is going to grow to the top, and essentially the blades are going to float at the surface, and so they create what's called the canopy up at the surface, just like a canopy in a terrestrial forest, right? The trees make the really tall trees make the canopy. And so these would be giant kelp, like in Southern California, or bull kelp. So this would be giant kelp right here, and these guys would be representative of bull kelp. And then as you go into deeper water, Depending on the kelp, it might just be their stipe, or it could also be blades, like the giant kelp has blades going all the way to the holdfast. The understory is made up of usually smaller algae. So, for example, this red algae here, called Pterogophora, and then you get to the very base, and we call that the substrate. Okay, so there's 3 dimensions: the canopy, the understory underneath the canopy, and then the seafloor, the hard structure on the bottom. And so you're gonna find smaller algae, and you'll also find lots of different living animals, lots of invertebrates, and in here you'll find lots of fish swimming around, hiding within the blades. Along the kelp you'll find invertebrates growing there. So you find lots of different things, and then also you're going to find marine mammals, sea otters, seals, sea lions, depending on where you go, and then also seabirds, of course, at the surface and diving down as well. Now, like I said, kelp forests along the west coast are composed of giant kelp, which is called Macrocystis, that's a genus, or bull kelp, Nereocystis is the genus. Giant kelp, which is pictured here, can grow from 27 centimeters per day to 61 centimeters per day. So that is extremely fast. So that basically means like they can grow like a foot a day. The giant kelp can live up to 7 years, and so they actually can often get to about 30 meters or 100 feet in length. So these can grow very, very tall and very long. The bull kelp grows about 10 centimeters per day, but it generally only lives for 1 year, and then it grows back the following year.
What is this, Amelia? Do you know what that is?
Kelp.
Yeah, it is. You're right.
This is what we're going to be learning about tomorrow. And since you see, we can't break it.
Type of kelp called a egregia, and
since
you just popped is called the nematocyst, and that's what
pop
keeps the egregia's blades floating towards the surface where the sunlight can get it.
Yeah.
Here, what my little assistant is holding is some bull kelp that has washed up, and you can see it's kind of dried out. That big bulb right there is the nematocyst. Yep. And the little things coming off of it, those are the blades, and they're obviously shriveled and broken off, so that's not what it actually looks like, but you can see that it's really, really long.
Look, and look how much I can't pull it.
You can't even get it out because it's stuck in there.
Well, look, I can't pull it.
Yeah. So you can see this line right here, that would have been how far the waves were coming up and hitting, and so let's just show you where the water line is now, right? So that is probably a combination of 2 things. It's a combination of the tide, changing over the course of the day, and also increase in sea level due to storms. And now what we have here, this is the other end of the kelp, the holdfast. So you can
I show them how
what it looks like.
This is the root.
It's not the, no, it's not the root. It's not a plant. It's called the holdfast.
Hold fast right here.
Mm-hmm.
And I am going to dig a hole and show you how it's supposed to be.
It's not in the dirt. It's on a rock. It's attached to a rock. So that's not quite right.
So
If you stuck it on a rock, then that would be right.
it's supposed to go like this or like
There you go. Very
Yeah.
nice. Thank you.
Kelp forests are important ecosystems, just like coral reefs are. They provide habitat for millions of species of invertebrates, fish, mammals, and birds. They are breeding grounds and a nursery area because they dampen the impact of waves. And usually it's slightly warmer within the kelp forest than it is in surrounding areas. So they are, with that, they provide protection for lots of living organisms, protection from predators because the predators can't find them, or the predators are big and they don't want to get tangled up in the kelp, and so they don't end up entering in there. And the food web over here is showing you an example food web of a kelp forest that has a sea otter in it. So sea otters are actually really important for kelp forest health. The sea otter, as you can see here, it eats lots of different types of invertebrates. Can even eat fish. But basically, a lot of these invertebrates, we can see, eat kelp and other algae. So what the sea otter does is it keeps those in check so that there aren't too many of them growing, because if there are too many, then they eat up all the kelp. So there's like kind of the traditional account of sea otters being taken away from kelp forests and what's happened. So basically back when sea otters were being hunted for their fur, the hunters essentially completely decimated the population of sea otters. And when the sea otters are taken away, one of their prey, the sea urchins, end up growing and reproducing, and the sea urchins like to eat kelp, and specifically they like to eat the holdfast of the kelp. So what's going to happen if the sea urchin eats the holdfast of the kelp? Well, the kelp is going to float away, right? So it's not even going to be there anymore. So basically, if you have too many sea urchins, they eat up all of the kelp floats away, and you no longer have a kelp forest at all, which means that you're not going to have any of the other organisms that live there anymore, and the ecosystem has basically been destroyed. Okay, and that's basically just because the sea otters are taken out of the environment. So the sea otters are referred to as being a keystone species. The keystone, the term keystone basically comes from the archway. The keystone is the centerpiece of that archway. If that piece gets taken out, then the whole arch falls. So that's basically what a keystone species is. The keystone species is a species that has a greater impact on its environment than what would be predicted by the abundance of it in that environment. So even though there are only a handful of sea otters in a kelp forest, they are basically keeping the whole kelp forest healthy. And in places where predators of sea urchins are taken away, what ends up happening is that instead of having the kelp forest, we have what are called sea urchin barrens, because it's just sea urchins and nothing else. Okay. Now there are some symbiotic relationships that exist in the kelp forest, just like in the coral reefs. So we have examples of mutualistic relationships. For example, in this image here, we see a senorita fish cleaning the parasites off of the blacksmith. So essentially, the blacksmith has parasites, and it comes along to the cleaning station, and the senorita fish comes up and bites off the parasites and makes the blacksmiths more healthy, and the senorita fish gets food by eating the parasites. And then there are tons of other examples of mutualism in the kelp forest as well. And then an example of commensalism is, well, one is the animals that live on the kelp, right? The kelp isn't bothered. The animals are getting protection and being able to live there. But another interesting example is found with bat stars and polychaete worms. So this image here is showing you the underside of a bat star, and we see this polychaete worm that's living in there. Now, at first glance, you may think that it's a parasite. It's not actually a parasite. It's just living on the underside of the bat star, so that when the bat star eats, the leftover pieces are able to be eaten by that worm. So essentially, the worm hitches a ride on the underside of the bat star and gets food and free meals, whereas the bat star isn't bothered by this worm living under it. There are also other photosynthesizing organisms in the ocean that are a smaller extent of productivity, but still important. Those marine plants include mangroves and seagrasses. And these are plants that have adapted to having waterlogged soils. They've adapted to changing salinity levels. Like most plants can't live in salt water at all. They've adapted to living in shallow, shifting, or soft sediments and shifting coastlines and wave activity. Okay, so mangroves, there are about 38 species that exist, and they have some adaptations for living in the marine environment. One, they actively exclude salt. So they're basically getting rid of excess salt that is in their tissues from the salt water that they are using to get the water. Some dump it into the leaves that will then fall off of the plant. They also have aerial roots, which are extensions that grow up into the air and essentially make it so that they can dry out a little bit. Some of them have buttress roots, which allow them to be stronger and exist in shifting sediments. And the reasons why mangroves are important is because they reduce the rates of erosion in an environment in the coast. They provide for substrate for algae and other things to attach to and grow. They provide food for insects, mollusks, crabs, terrestrial mammals. So they can both provide nutrients and habitats for marine species and also for terrestrial species as well. They're also an important contributor to additions of nutrients into the environment. So when the mangrove leaves fall off, those leaves can then, they have nutrients locked in them. They can then get broken down by bacteria and be recycled into the environment. So they can provide for an increased nutrient load in an otherwise low nutrient environment. Okay, and this is where we find mangroves, mostly tropical and coastal like corals. Okay, and the other category of marine plants are seagrasses. There are about 50 to 60 species of seagrasses that are adapted for living underwater in salty environments. So their adaptations include deep, thick roots with horizontal roots or rhizomes that grow. So that makes them difficult to pull out. So when waves come along, they're anchored in pretty strongly. Their leaves are also ribbon-shaped, which means that they can very easily move with the current and with the wave activity. Their leaves also have air spaces in them, which make them more buoyant so that they can float up towards the surface and get more sunlight. They also have the ability to excrete salt from their tissues and from their cells so that they won't dehydrate, essentially. Okay, importance in seagrass beds is, again, that they reduce erosion just like mangroves do. They provide food for fish and also for manatees, for turtles, or the seagrass eating turtles like green turtles, and also provide habitat and food for invertebrates. They provide for a nursery zone and habitat for lots of different species and protection for them as well. And this is where you find seagrasses. So seagrasses are actually found all over the world. They're not limited to tropical waters or cold waters. They're actually found pretty much everywhere.
Okay, answer the following questions. Name the types of large photosynthetic organisms in the ocean. Is coral an autotroph or heterotroph? What is the relationship between coral and zooxanthellae? State the function of the following parts of kelp: nematocyst, blade, holdfast, and stipe. And 5, give an example of a mutualistic symbiosis in coral reefs. 6, give an example of a mutualistic symbiosis in kelp forests. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope you are doing well.